Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good middle of the night, wherever you are in the world. I am Laura Janusik, and I would like to welcome you to the International Listening Association's webinar series, the fourth webinar in our 2017 series entitled Advancing Listening Research. And I am really excited about the guests that we have today, who are Debra Worthington and Bodie. The topic is going to be, obviously, listening research, and they will be introducing a book that they co-edited, the Sourcebook of Listening Research, Methodology and Measures. And I cannot think of two better listening researchers to have on board with us today. So I would like to personally welcome those two. And before we actually get to you, we have to get to a few of the requirements for the webinar. So Phil, if you want to take us through the tips for participants.
Sure, absolutely. It's great to be with you all, and welcome, as Laura said. Couple of tips here. I have muted everybody during the webinar. If you have any questions that you would like to ask, I'll also be monitoring the chat box. If you look at the bottom of your screen, and on some there might be on the side, you'll see a toolbar. And one of those areas on the far left is a microphone icon, and that controls the mute. I'm able to mute everybody. The other icon next to it is for the video cam. So if you don't want to be seen on video, because we have the video cams running on the side, you can also decide not to use the video. In about the middle of the screen, there's a chat icon. So if you have questions, please open it up, and you can select one of the hosts or the co-hosts or even everybody, and I'll be monitoring that. When we do leave, please the best way to end is just end meeting, but we're still far from that. So sit back, relax, let us have your questions, and enjoy this, what I know is going to be a fascinating webinar.
Absolutely. Thanks, Phil. And for a few introductions, I'm Laura Janusik. I'm the producer, host. I don't know what I am, but I'm really excited to put together this webinar series with Phil. And we've had some terrific guests over the last year and a half, and we've got many more scheduled to come. I'm currently a professor at Rockhurst University in Kansas City, Missouri, and I'm also a consultant. I like to fancy myself a listening researcher, but nowhere in the atmosphere as Debra and Graham are. My research areas include listening cognitions, metacognitions, and pedagogy. I've been an ILA member since 1998, and I was president in 2010 to 2011. Phil, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Sure. Once again, I'm Phil Turpak, and I'll be your technical guy. I'll be monitoring everything here, and I'm coming to you from the beautiful Annandale campus of Northern Virginia Community College, one of the largest community colleges in the nation. In addition to being an instructor of communication studies, I'm also a Virginia master teacher, and my specialty area is listening and student success. So I am really very excited about this particular webinar. As Laura was, I also am a past president of the International Listening Association, and I was the president in 2015 to 2016.
Perfect. Thanks, Phil. And our two guests today are Debra Worthington and Bodie. They are the co-editors of a new book that was just released called The Sourcebook of Listening Research, Methodology and Measures. And I'll be able to show you a picture of the front of that, the cover of that book in a second. And there's also a discount code. So if you actually order the book within the next few months, you'll get a discount for participating in this webinar. Now, Debra, on the left there, is a professor and associate director of communication at Auburn University in, oh gosh, where's Auburn?
Alabama.
Debra, Alabama, thank you. That's exactly where I thought it was, but I wasn't sure. It just went away. She's the principal author of this book, and she has won research awards in various organizations, including the International Listening Association, the European Communication Association, and the National Communication Association. And Graham Bodie is, Debra, I think we would both call him a god of listening research. Would that be correct?
Let's not give him a big head.
Yeah, that's right.
I think he and his graduate students have done more for listening research in the last decade than listening researchers have in the past 50 or 60 years. He's currently on the faculty at Meek School of Journalism and New Media at the University of Mississippi. He has published internationally in many, many different journals, and he is obviously the co-editor of this book as well. And this is what this book looks like: the Sourcebook of Listening Research Methodology and Measures. It's available from Wiley, and the internet address there is at the bottom. You can order it for a 20% discount with the code that's shown on the screen. And not to worry, because I'm going to take off my share screen, but I will go back to the screen intermittently throughout. So if you don't get a chance to write everything down right now, we'll certainly come back to this. If you would like to jot down my email address, if you have questions or for some reason you don't get this, get to be able to write all of this down, you can contact me at ljanusik@gmail.com. Again, that's ljanusik@gmail.com. And Sheila, I see you writing down, so I'm going to not stop or not quit sharing the screen until I think you've got it. So just nod when you've got it since you're muted. Got it. Perfect. Okay, so let us go back here. Graham and Debra, welcome, welcome, welcome. Can you tell me the story about how this book came into being?
I guess I'll start. It was one of those things that I was first introduced to the field of listening by Margaret Fitchhauser. She's recently retired, but is a longtime researcher and trainer in listening techniques. And so I originally was interested in legal communication, jury decision making, and when she introduced me to the field, it made sense to me that if you think about what jurors do, they sit around in a room all day long, at least in the U.S. system, and listen to judges and attorneys and witnesses, essentially give their stories or their side of the events in question. And so I started doing some research tying listening to jury decision making together. But one of the things that I soon discovered and began getting frustrated with is that many of the measurements that we were using didn't seem to hold up, well in terms, particularly in terms of their reliability from a research standpoint. And this is something that I had, Graham is a former student, both undergraduate and MA from Auburn University. And so I had the pleasure of having him in class quite a while back. But we started talking about this at conferences and things like that. And so it just sort of went from there. We worked on several papers together, sort of exploring this idea. And I was working on something, I can't even remember what it was now, and I was holding a handbook because I was trying to get to learn a little bit more background and looking at some of the measurements and their critiques of the measure. And I'm like, why are we not doing this? And so I shot Graham an email and I'm like, we need to work on this. This was the book project that sort of really resonated with me. And thank goodness Graham was on board to do it, because we complement each other very well when we work together. It's, I think, sometimes hard to find someone that you can what I'm good at and like to do, or the things that he doesn't like to do. And so it just is a really good collaboration, and the project was a wonderful collaboration. And the great thing about it is I got to meet via the internet, all kinds of people who are doing research that's in our field, related to our field, and so on. So it's sort of a long answer, but that's really how the book came into being.
That's terrific. And let's just check back with Graham. Graham, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think her story is how I remember it. For anybody that's looking at writing a book or is in the process of doing some larger project, this started in around 2006 or 7, and as you see, the date on the publication date is 2017. And between, of course, 2006, 2007, and now, the book changed several times in scope, from something a little bit less bulky to what you see, which was a collaborative kind of creation. Every time we kind of after we got the contract and we turned back to the table of contents, we kept thinking about things that we would want to add and do. And Wiley was nice enough to kind of go along with us on all of those different iterations. So, between the time we started and got a contract, that was probably about 7 years. And then it was another 3 years, 2 or 3 years before we actually came to the final product. So, it wasn't like it was created overnight or even in a year's time span. It was something that we've been thinking about for about a decade.
What was your initial scope of the book, and what did it turn into?
It was a little bit more similar, if you're familiar with the communication research measures Sourcebook. The first volume was published sometime in the 80s or 90s, and the second volume was published in 2016, 2015, somewhere around there. I think that was initially kind of our scope, was just to have the sort of the back half of the book, the second half of the book, which is the profile of the measures. And so what we, not only did we add to, I think our original table of contents had maybe 30 measures, and it ended up being 65 total in the final version. But we added the 6 chapters to go with that up front. So it went from, here's some measures, good luck, to here's some measures, oh, by the way, here's the context behind what type of what these measures measure, not just throwing the measure out there for people to use.
If anyone on this webinar were to open the book, what would it look like to us? How is it organized?
It's divided into 3 sections. The first section is basically the introductory section, is 1 chapter where we really focus just on, for a long time, listening scholars were sort of stuck on trying to define listening. And so we give a historical and sort of a theoretical perspective, and then our assessment of that search, if you will, for the definition of listening. Section 2 is a larger section on measuring listening, because the argument that Graham has made in previous articles that he's published, and one that we've certainly made in presentations that we've done, is that we as researchers in this field have not always we haven't always engaged in best research practices. And that's not unusual for a field that's up and coming and trying to establish itself. But if we're going to be taken seriously by, other communication scholars, scholars in psychology or other fields, then this is something that we really need to knuckle down on and really need to start paying serious attention to. And so we talk about measurement in very general terms for young scholars, such as the basics of reliability and validity and things like that. But we also talk about issues associated with measuring listening from a quantitative, perspective, a qualitative, perspective. And we break it down with 3 chapters, one that focuses on measuring behavioral components, cognitive components is the second one, and then affective components. So sort of a general view, but then some very specific, areas of analysis.
Did I hear you correctly, Debra, in that the way the instruments then are organized are the behavioral ones first, then the cognitive, then the affective, or no?
No. Section 2 just talks about research in general.
Okay.
But what we've seen in the past is that when listening scholars have approached the study of listening, they tend to focus sort of on cognitive components. Another area is behavioral, skills kind of thing. And then the third one are the sort of affective, how we feel about listening, if you will. And our perspective from that view. The profiles themselves, that is the critique of the listening and listening related measures, that's in section 3. It's a completely different section. That's where the 65 critiques that Graham mentioned earlier are located.
So you have 65 listening instruments.
It was a gift that kept on giving. I mean, we run across one, and it's like, oh, we really need to include that one. And then there would be somebody who would graciously agree to do a critique. It was wonderful.
Oh, that is terrific.
Frightening sometimes, because the book kept getting bigger and bigger. And it's like, at what point is Wiley going to say, stop, no more,
How many, 65 instruments, how are those organized?
Graham, you want to take this one?
So they're alphabetical order, and so each of the profiles has a standard format for the most part, where we start off with the kind of the background, the development of the scale. We name up front whether it primarily measures cognitive, affective, or behavioral elements, or all 3, or 2 of the 3. It goes through the development. It goes through how you administer the scale, how you score the scale. Provides the sample studies. In some cases, that's every study that's ever been done, because the instrument's only been used a few times. And in other cases, it only can give you a very small sample of the studies that have been conducted. And then it provides a critique of the scale. In some cases, it says, don't use it. And in other cases, it says use it with caution, or use it in these ways, even though other people have used it in these other ways. We primarily think that it should be used in only these ways. And then the scale itself, if it's not proprietary, if it's available to be printed, we got permission to print the scale items themselves with instructions, as well as if you could modify the scale in some way. For instance, if it's a self-assessment as opposed to assessing another person, we gave the alternative wording of the items that you would use to change and modify the scale to fit what you need to do. So what you ought to be able to do with each of these profiles is take the scale and immediately be able to know how to administer it after about a 5 or 10 minute sit down with the chapter.
Yeah. Now, Graham, you said something that really was of interest to me. You said that you did include scales in here that you wouldn't recommend using, which I think is an interesting approach. Can you tell us a little bit more about which ones those might be and why you chose to do that?
So there are some scales that are so popular that regardless of how many times Debra and I have written don't use it in journal articles, people still use them. The Watson-Barker listening test is a key example of that. What you have in the WBLT is a basically 40 uncorrelated multiple choice items that are supposed to load on to 5 types of listening, or 5 factors, but it just doesn't do that ever. Has never done that, in fact, from the beginning. And so we felt like because the WBLT is used so much, that we needed to include it and provide, some sufficient evidence for our claim that we ought not be using that measure. I can't off the top of my head think of any others that are like that, but there are other one. There's another one that was used quite a bit in the 80s. The name is escaping me. I'll look at it in just a minute, but it's only been used, 2 or 3 times, but we felt like it had enough value that we should present it with some caution and say, here's how it has been used and how we see it can be used, but there's not a lot of data. So, beware, buyer beware, so to speak.
I can give you another example, and that would be and that's some of the early research that Graham and I got involved in, dealt with the listening style profile. And because the reliability estimates, sometimes they seem to be fine, but then other reported instances, in my experience with them, they would just be terrible. So eventually what we did is that we worked on refining that scale and rethinking what it should look like. And so we talk about both of the scales, the different perspectives of the scales, and then provide them in the book, because the original LSP, I still see articles, despite the fact that if you really do a deep dive into the literature, you're going to see the problems, with it. Sometimes people take the path of least resistance. They see it, it's been used before, and they don't necessarily try to look at the literature as a whole that has used that particular scale. Same thing for the WBLT. And so they'll look at a couple of articles, some of the seminal work, and they think this looks like a solid, measure. And sometimes you can't tell unless you really do, as I said before, a deep dive into the literature and look at, really everything that's been published on it. And then you can start seeing some of the issues with the scale. And of course, some of the more recent articles that I've worked on and that Graham has worked on, either collaboratively or independently, help establish, some of these issues. So, and some scales just haven't had enough research. We don't know what to recommend. It's like Graham said, we recommend it with caution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there's not enough out there. Now, you had said something interesting to me earlier too, Debra, and I remember having this conversation with Graham at a coffee shop at one point. But you talked about defining listening, and you dedicate kind of a chapter to, should we find a definition for listening or not? And I know that we've got some new researchers on the webinar today. So if you could kind of summarize your argument, yes or no, and why, that would be terrific.
Well, basically, to give you an idea, is I love this first chapter because one of the things that it does is we have a lovely table in there that gives you dozens of definitions that people have used over time to define, to define listening, including the one that is on the International Listening Association's website. Okay. Graham and I were not part of those discussions in the 1990s because he was extremely young and I was in a completely...
I wasn't even born yet.
You were born in the 90s. Anyway, but it was our understanding that there were a group of researchers and they spent a lot of time in the 80s and the 90s trying to figure out what is listening and how to define it, because it was like if we could figure out how to define it, then we've identified the important and primary component parts and we can move on and, the life would be good. Well, the problem with that is from a research perspective, when you start talking about defining listening, it's going to depend on the research question. Are you looking at, what context are you looking in, or looking at? Are you looking at it from a cognitive view? Are we looking at it more from a behavioral viewpoint? And so one of the things in the last paragraph of the chapter we talk about is the fact that we're not going to give people the definition of listening, because we argue that is essentially putting the cart before the horse, is that you need to figure out what your research questions are, and then how you approach listening, define it, if you will, is going to be based on, on that hypothesis, that the research question that you're trying to approach or, test. And so I'll give it to Graham here, because he probably has something he wants to add to it as well.
No, I love definitions. And I think if you think about, picking up a dictionary and looking at any given word in there, you're likely to see the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to however many definitions there are for that particular word. And I think listening is the same. I think if you look at like that chapter that we do, there's this history of defining listening where, at least in the early 70s, it was all cognitive. And what they thought of as behaviors were things that people did with information in their head as they were trying to figure out what other people were saying. So there was no, and so if that kind of translated to the 80s and early 90s of people arguing over whether a response should be in the definition. And whether a response instigated a new process and therefore was outside the scope of listening research. And of course, we know how that story ends, because we're all sitting here and acknowledging that behavior is a pretty important part of that process. Now, those early definitions gave a nod to these motivational or affective components, these attitudinal components, but they weren't a primary driver of listening research until kind of the proliferation of self-report scales in the later 90s and early 2000s, when people started to create these kind of scales. So our take on that is that definitions are functional. They are not right or wrong, but more or less useful for the purposes that you want to serve in that particular research project. So everybody on my screen right now may have a slightly different definition of listening, and that's okay if their purposes are slightly different.
So the definition has to tie to the research that you're conducting, as opposed to a big overarching definition of listening.
Yes.
From a research perspective, yes. Mm-hmm.
Terrific. Now, you both mentioned context, and I look at the people who are on the webinar, and I know we've got qualitative researchers out there. We've got people from healthcare. We have people in OT, PT. We've got people in business. What kind of measures are in the book that might be of interest to them?
I actually have the list here because I knew you would ask this question, and then I would draw a complete blank when it happened. For business perspective, one of the measures that's in the book is called Leader Member Exchange questionnaire. So it was one that I wasn't really familiar with, quite that much. We have the golden oldie, if you will. This was talked about in early literature, and we then went looking for it, and that was the Listening Practices Feedback Report. It's a 360 measure. Let's see, and we've got some that are specifically related to health. An example of one that's related to social support is multidimensional evaluation of enacted social support. And there was another one specifically related to health that I definitely wanted to.
Well, there's several questionnaires that assess healthcare provider or doctors listening. There's the Doctor's Interpersonal Skills Questionnaire.
That's the one.
And so there's several from the healthcare arena, from the physician patient literature that we've included in there. There's the Hurrier profile, so we did get permission to print that profile, for instance. So I think you'll find a pretty wide variety of scales and assessment instruments, and as well as methodologies. We do have a couple of profiles that are methodological rather than measures. And so we have, profiles of how you would go about micro-analyzing face-to-face dialogue, how you might design a interaction study where you have people talking to each other, dyadic study, and several other kind of methods. There's 2 or 3 other methods like that. We have a pretty big profile on time studies, and we kind of lumped all those together as kind of a group of measures, even though, Laura, you and Andrew Wilvin have used one measure, and then there's another group that's used another measure, and then there's a whole engineering. There's a literature like engineers love to measure how much people talk and listen, and they do it very differently than we do it as communication scholars, and so we've included those time scales in there as well as methods like they used to give people watches, and so the watch would beep 2 or 3 times a day, and they would fill out their paper and pencil. So we've included all that kind of stuff in there, even though there are technologies out there that have advanced us past watches and pencil and paper technology. Just to give people an idea of there's this whole range of things that we may not even have heard of because we are in one discipline, and other disciplines are measuring these things, and we're kind of trying to bring that multidisciplinary take on the field as well.
Yeah, I see that there are some questions that have come in. Graham, if I could say, Graham, you seem to be having a lot of feedback when you speak.
Yes.
So I don't know if it's the volume of your microphone or something, but I just wanted to see if you might want to adjust something there. And I wish I could tell you what to adjust, but I'm sounding like I have feedback now too, so that's driving me crazy. But we've got a question from Kathy O'Brien. Fascinated by the definition discussion. Any comments from Debra and Graham about defining listening more from a learning perspective? What if the learners are not researchers, but just people who want to understand listening better?
That's Kathy. Margaret Fitchhauser and I just finished with the 2nd edition of our textbook, and it should be coming out in the spring. And we actually address this question, is that I think that from a learning perspective, or looking at it as a non-researcher, there is some actual overlap there. I would say that oftentimes when we talk about listening as individuals, we oftentimes have specific goals. So we may be listening for social support, or we want someone to listen for social support. We may, be listening. There's a chapter in the book on doctor-patient relationships, and so our goals when we go to the physician, are very specific. And so I think that when we talk about, we're going back to that idea of context that Laura mentioned earlier, that we can talk about listening goals, listening objectives, and how they may change when we're in a relationship with someone, and maybe we're trying to repair that relationship. Or again, earlier today, I found out that the father of a very good friend of mine has passed away, and so the listening that goes into that type of a true social support, there's a different kind of goal that happens with the listening. One of the questions that we ask, and I think we briefly touch on it in the source book, but in the textbook that I've just finished with Margaret, we spend some time on is, we have the technology today, and what does this mean for listening? How does it affect the goals that we have for listening, our interactions with others? And because not all listening, we use this idea of listening as a metaphor for times when it's not oral, okay? And what does that mean for us, as both as researchers and as individuals when we start using, that listening metaphor in, ways outside of the traditional way in which we talk about listening. So I don't know if I completely answered your question, but I think it's an interesting one that you make. So.
Thanks for so helpful sharing, Debra.
Terrific. We also have a question from Jenny Grau. Are there any listening measures that measure the listener's behaviors and cognitions and the speaker's perceptions, affect, of being listened to?
Yes, I'm trying to remember the name of it because I know that there is one that does, it's multiple. So, hold that button. There is a perceived partner responsiveness scale. Okay. And this is going to sound really terrible, but I left my copy of the book at the office. And so I would have to look it up online to, you know, to go in depth on that scale. But there was another one that I know that, oh, this is terrible.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would wonder, what do you mean by measuring cognitions?
Thanks for unmuting me. My question was to think about listening as the person doing the listening is having thoughts, maybe comprehensions, and then is also exhibiting behaviors, head nodding, use of silence, paraphrase. So those two sets of attention as a measurement instrument are focused on the listener. But because of that behavior, there will likely be perception that the speaker has about the quality of the listening, particularly the feeling of being listened to or not listened to. And I'm curious to know what instruments are looking at that interplay.
Yeah, with that explanation, I'm not sure there's a single instrument that does all of that. There's an instrument by Avi Kluger that does the second part of that, where it's the perceptual, do I feel like I'm being listened to? And do I feel like the listener is doing specific behaviors? There's several of those measures.
Mm-hmm. The empathic accuracy scale may get to that to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, so measuring empathic accuracy, that paradigm, people have a conversation, and then after the conversation, they're split up, and they watch the video separately, and they write down, they stop the tape whenever they feel like they had a thought or a feeling in the conversation, and they write down what they were thinking or feeling. And then the empathic accuracy is a degree to which those two things match.
Interesting.
So there's there's maybe some part of what you're talking about in that methodology.
Thanks.
Cool. And then we've got a question from Terry Werner. What's the difference between, and I think this is a book title, right, Terry? Can you nod, Terry? Yes. Listening Processes, Functions, and Competency, and the book you and Graham have published.
The first book is a textbook. It's written specifically for for undergraduate college level type, and then the source book, it was the source book is interesting because it's really written primarily for researchers, but we included those chapters that I mentioned in section 2. So if you have a graduate level class that's going to be focusing on listening and doing research and listening, then the book might be appropriate, either as the primary text or definitely as a supplementary text, a secondary text to that type of class. So they're really very different audiences. The source book is written for the section 2 is written for new scholars that are trying to build their skills and understand really some of the methodological issues that are related, and established scholars as well, methodological issues that are related to listening. These are people who are trying to get oftentimes trying to get a research program started in this area. It's good for grad students who are trying to explore it, and maybe this is something they want to do and they're trying to do a project for a class or something like that. So again, they can use the section 2 on measuring listening to understand those aspects of it. But the measurement profiles, I mean, for those of us who do research, sometimes you're just not familiar with the many types of measures, and sort of like one-stop shopping so that you can sort of see what's available out there is really helpful when you're getting started, or you just want to be able to do a quick critique of something. Because I go back to these critiques now when I'm looking at thinking about the study that I'm getting ready to start in the spring. It's like, well, let me go back and look at this and see if there's one of these, because it's so nice to already have this nice little critique, you know, sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly, if you will, of the different measures, you know, essentially done for you. So that's really the difference between the two books. There's a very different audience for the two.
Yeah, and so the thought just went right out of my mind. I'm sorry, I hate that. It always happens at least once per webinar. So hopefully that was my once this time. It was a really brilliant thought too. We've got something from Mark Wong here. Mark Wong says, people speak for many reasons: to teach, to share, sorrow. We need to know how to listen in all of these situations. And I think he's referring back to the defining listening discussion.
I like that comment for a couple of reasons. We point out in the book, particularly in the cognitive chapter, I believe, a lot of the suggestions that we have floated around for the past 20 years or so about how to be a good listener are based on the work of Nichols. And as great of a study as that was, and as good of a foundation as he provided, you remember he did a 10-item multiple choice test after people listened to a lecture in a classroom setting in the 1930s, which is the to teach maybe, right? That there may be a certain set of processes and a certain set of behaviors, a certain set of things you do prior to, during, and after listening, if you want to talk about metacognitive strategies, that are quite appropriate for listening to lecture material, but may or may not be appropriate for listening to your friend, or listening to Debra now that she's realized that her friend's father is or listening to your daughter after school one Wednesday afternoon, and she's telling you about how much fun she had at recess. And the list of those examples can go on and on. So I think there's the potential, and I think this is what Woven and Company tried to do with psychology, is to argue that there are potentially a set of listening skills, what they call comprehension and discriminative listening, that potentially underlie all listening situations, irrespective of whether they're in the classroom or in the boardroom or wherever they are. And then there are these higher level skills, the therapeutic, the appreciative listening, and the other one that I can't think of off the top of my head, that are maybe context specific, that build upon those basic level listening skills. And I think we're starting to realize that at a conceptual and a theoretical level, and we're just starting to study those things at an empirical level.
Phil, if I could ask you to maybe try to look for something else. I know Phil suggested that maybe it's our volumes are turned up too high, which is why we're getting the feedback. So I know I turned down my volume, but I'm still hearing feedback of me. And so I'm assuming that you're all hearing feedback of me as well. Would that be correct? Yeah.
Just one suggestion here, everybody, if I could just butt in for a second. Echo can be caused by having a phone too close to the speaker, or it can be volume. I'm doing some research on it right now, so I apologize. I know I'm keeping myself muted.
Okay, thanks for looking into it, Phil. I do have a question from Juliana, our graduate student from Columbia. Where did it go? She says, you as researchers of the listening consider that the development of an a priori research instrument can condition the results? Question mark. Should the instruments be more qualitative or of a quantitative cut?
Graham, I'm going to leave that one to you.
Yeah, I mean, any research method, whether you're going to attach numbers to data or not, is going to influence potentially your results. I mean, that was the aha moment of, you know, non-Vienna circle, you know, positivism, is that there is no such thing as like an objective reality that you go out there and you look at and you touch and taste and smell and see. Everything's conditioned by your theoretical stance, by your instruments, by your biases and your mindset. So to me, it doesn't matter whether you're doing so-called qualitative or so-called quantitative research. You're biased going into the door. And nothing's going to change that, whether you want to say grounded research helps that or not. There's still biases that are going to influence the research. And so, you know, if you're doing research, and I think one of the ways that more grounded research can help is with the development of surveys or with the validation of surveys. So as researchers, oftentimes we think that we've got these factors. Well, research subjects may not see the world the same way that we see the world. And so it's always good to step back and question how the people that we're interviewing and surveying and doing experiments with, whether they see the concept that we've defined, whether they see that concept defined in similar ways, or whether there's different ways that they're defining that concept. I think a good example of this is the instrument that Laura and Marguerite developed, the listening concepts inventory, that tries to get at this notion that people have different conceptualizations or definitions of listening. And I think the same thing is true for any concept or any sub-construct of listening that you might study.
Oh, that was me. My breath intake there. Mark Wong says, I think one of the speaking host microphones is close to a loudspeaker. If you take turns muting yourself, you might be able to isolate the problem. So it could be a problem of Phil, me, Debra, or Graham. And since I'm the only one talking right now, so they're all muted. So I'm thinking maybe it's not mine, which is good if I could answer all of your questions. So let's bring Graham on.
Here's mine.
Talk a little bit more, Graham.
Test. Here's mine. Can you hear some feedback?
No, you are sounding really good right now. Debra?
There it is.
Here I am. I don't know how much feedback you're getting off of me.
I am getting none off of you right now, which is terrific.
I am right now.
You are? Maybe it's the fact that we have 3 of us on then. Phil, could that be one of the challenges?
I don't think so. Mark has a point there. If you can't hear the echo, then it probably is you.
Yes.
And so I know right now I can't hear the echo, but I'm going to mute myself. So we may want to mute ourselves until we're speaking.
I'm pretty sure it's coming from Debra's microphone.
You're just saying that, Graham.
That's my hypothesis.
I don't think you have anything to support that, but I could be absolutely wrong. I'm thinking right now it's probably a good time to take maybe a 5-minute break. And I see that in chat, Terry Varner has written down the information about the title and the ISBN number and the fact that it's 664 pages and the hardcover cost is $155 and the ebook is $124.99. And the only thing, Terry, we don't have there is the discount code, but I will write that down for people. So let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break. And then when we come back, think of other questions that you want to ask these two. You have them at your disposal. Welcome back to the webinar. We've moved to the strictly question and answer portion for it. So if you have any questions, feel free to either type them in chat or you can unmute yourself and ask. And I know that Sheila has asked to ask a question, a complicated question, I understand. Sheila Bentley, what's your complicated question?
Well, as Mark mentioned, you know, people listen for a lot of reasons and people communicate for a lot of reasons. And it seems like that one of the difficulties in the definition and the research is that there's this whole host of behaviors. So when I say something to someone, there's this whole host of behaviors that represent different cognitive processes. And I'm looking for certain ones, depending on what I'm communicating about. I'm looking for certain behaviors, whether it's that you're making eye contact or that you know, say something back to me or that you give me a hug or whatever. But I'm looking for certain behaviors. And it's almost like there's a tipping point of, you know, a combination of behaviors. If I get this behavior, and this behavior, then I decide that you listen to me. But if there's one that's significant that's missing, then I say, you know, you weren't really listening to me. How would you ever structure an instrument that would allow for all these combinations, you know, where sometimes I want eye contact and sometimes it doesn't matter whether I have eye contact, or sometimes I want you to echo the emotion and other times you don't have to. How would you create not only a definition that deals with this sort of accumulation of a bunch of different behaviors, that if you get the right accumulation, then we say, oh, okay, you listened to me, you were effective, that sort of thing. But if we don't get the ones that we were specifically looking for, or we don't get, you know, again, kind of enough listening behaviors for me to say, you listened to me. Anyway, how would you create not only a definition that addresses that, but also an instrument that measures, you know, whether it's a quantity or a quality or a specific combination of behaviors that represent different cognitive processes, or, you know, ones that represent that there was, you know, you got the emotion that I was expressing.
Yeah, so I mean, you asked the question, I think has a couple of different answers, at least two different answers. One is there's something in the measurement of the perception or the expectation. So any given conversationalist, speaker, if you want to, you know, separate speaker and listener, they have a set of expectations for what they want the listener to do, how they want the listener to behave. And then there's what the listener actually does. And so there's one thing to try to create a measure that tries to match the doing and the expectations. And then there's another kind of question with designing something that just looks at whether the presence of actual behaviors is additive or interactive or some power function or some other kind of mathematical function. The only way to get at that second question is to actually have people behave. And I'm not sure you can create an instrument per se, because then you have to train people to sit there and code those behaviors. Rather, I think we're at a point which gets a little bit in a very weird way to Doyle's question, which is we have these technologies that are available, and we touch on them a little bit in the book. But I think when and if we do a second edition, there's some room to expand on these automatic behavioral, capturing behaviors automatically. So you have something very simply like the Xbox Connect, I think is what it is. And it looks at behavior across 24 points of the human body. So it pins different points of your body, and it, you know, you're moving around and you're doing all kinds of things, and it maps those movements. And then you can model those movements, and you can look for patterns in those movements using different kind of statistical techniques. And so there are people who are doing this kind of work, and that kind of work would answer the question in any given context or in the presence of any given listener, potentially with any given set of expectations, what behaviors or combination of behaviors is best suited to be perceived as a good listener in those situations. But we're never going to answer that if we ask people what they did, or if we ask people what they thought somebody did. That's not going to answer the question. You're only going to get that by actually looking at the behavior that people are enacting.
Well, may I ask a second piece to that question?
Sure.
Does it have to be a behavior? I mean, I was at the summer conference where we came up with the definition of listening, and there was, big argument back and forth about whether listening had to include behaviors, and we had people who said absolutely, that person was definitely a behaviorist, and he said if you don't get the behaviors, there's no listening. And other people said, well, that's not true. Sometimes somebody exhibits no behaviors, but they have listened. They didn't nod their head, they didn't make eye contact, they didn't do any of these things, but they listened. So how do we again create definitions and instruments that measure everything from there has to be behavior to there doesn't have to be behavior?
Well, yeah, you're asking about whether listening happened, or
right.
whether someone perceives you as a good listener. I think those are two different questions, right?
But is it possible for somebody to perceive you as a good listener even when you didn't exhibit any of the behaviors? Does there have to be behavior?
Maybe. I don't know. I think that's an empirical question, but you would still need to measure behavior to answer it.
Sheila, I don't know if you remember Kai Degner or not. He's come to the conferences, and I love his definition of listening, because I think within the context of what you're speaking in terms of behaviors, it fits really well. He says listening is what it takes to make the speaker feel heard and understood. So there are a combination of things, and you were talking about, for some people, eye contact is really important. So if you don't give me eye contact, then I'm going to assume you didn't listen. Even though you might have had the posture, you might be able to paraphrase what I said, you might be able to do a lot of other things, but because I didn't have that eye contact, you're going to say that I'm a bad listener. And so I think as speakers, we have to figure out, as listeners, we have to, I'm not sure which one it is. As I guess it would be as speakers, we have to figure out what the listener wants and then try to give it to him or her. Just a thought. Graham, you had mentioned Doyle's question, and I will read it so everybody is aware of it. We're interested in how technological change may be making the ground under our feet move. It's changing dating, conflict behavior, and a lot of other interpersonal context. Is it changing listening as well? Are there recent research findings that you think shed light on how new technologies are changing any of the facets of listening behavior? Are any of the instruments in the book well suited to pursuing that topic? Great question.
I don't know that there's one specific one that sort of like gets at people's interaction with technology specifically. I mean, one that we did include that is somewhat related to, at least tangentially related to technology, and I've used it in some other research that I've done, is Weinstein's noise sensitivity scale. Because some people are more sensitive to the noises around them, and the research project that we used it as part of dealt with people's interactions with regards to mobile devices, specifically mobile phones, and because mobile phones have essentially they've affected our interactions, as we well know. I don't have to go into detail there about how it's affected our interactions, but there are a number of things that we've looked at, sort of like, does it affect how we manage privacy, was one of the things that I'm really interested in. And one of the studies, and I cannot remember the authors to it, but that I found totally fascinating, and I talk about it in my classes, is that the mere presence of a mobile phone on the table when you are at dinner or having a conversation, coffee with friends or something like that, changes the dynamics of that interaction. And so, because it's like there's this third person any moment that could come into and, and be a part, either be a part of that conversation or interrupt that conversation. And we know it at a moment's notice, it'll buzz or ring or, ding at us. And there's a text that someone, feels like they have to check right then and there. Absolutely, I would argue that the media in its many forms has affected how we listen. We touch on this in the textbook that I wrote. We've got a chapter on that now that just touches on it in a variety of contexts, how it's changed the way that we interact with one another, and certainly changes our listening, as well. But I'm completely fascinated with mobile devices and how they impact our interactions with each other on a daily basis.
Yeah, and I'm sorry. Go ahead, Graham.
I like how you phrase that. Make the ground under our feet move. I'm not as reactionary to that sentence as I am oftentimes when grad students come to me and say, I want to study this in Facebook. And I always go, why? Because I think a lot of times, yes, is technology, changing the way, changing things? I mean, absolutely. There's no doubt that there's certain things that is changing. But there's a lot of things that are very fundamentally, at least at a very concrete level, very similar, right? So if you think about the changes in technology of transportation, right, going from riding horses to bicycles to cars to airplanes, boats and airplanes, like fundamentally people are going from point A to point B. An airplane gets you there quicker and it opens up the globe and there's a lot of things that changes, but fundamentally there's some fundamental things that are the same. Right. And I think we often lose the forest for the trees when we run after looking for difference and distinction and change, when there's a lot of patterns of difference and change in those patterns of similarity. And so my argument to people who want to study technology for the sake of technology, which I'm not saying you're one of those, but it oftentimes is a graduate student who comes and is really excited about studying technology. I always try to temper that with, don't lose sight of the similarities in those patterns of differences, because there are lots of things that don't change, or there are things that we think have changed that really haven't changed all that much. So that's my devil's advocate, just because I think Doyle will appreciate that devil's advocate point of view.
Well, thank you for that, Graham. I know that many of you out there are teachers, and I can say that fundamentally it seems like learning in the classroom has changed significantly, I would say, in the last decade. And Terry Varner and I are actually right now coding some qualitative research on how students perceive themselves to have prepared for listening before class, to listen during class, and then what they did to reflect on whether they listened well or not in class. And one of the things that I'm seeing is, eye contact. They believe eye contact is one of those really big indicators of listening. So even though I had eye contact, I can't understand why I didn't understand the lecture, right? Because they don't understand that there's more to listening than simply eye contact. Or another one is the PowerPoint notes. Writing what was on the PowerPoint notes and not paraphrasing it or putting it into their own wording, and then being surprised that they didn't understand what the professor really wanted them to understand. So I would say fundamentally, from my experience, it seems like students are very different in the classroom.
I'm going to bounce off of two things that you said. Is that one of the things that we know in some of the learning literature is that, because you were talking about eye contact, is for small children, if we ask them to, I mean, really small children, 3, 4, 5 years old, when we try to talk to them, at least in American cultures, eye contact is really important. And so you'll hear parents say something like, look at me when I'm talking it to you, okay, which is not true in other cultures, but it's true here in the U.S., at least in mainstream culture. And so what happens is that faces are highly stimulating to very small children. And so when you ask a child a question and they look away sometimes, or you're trying to talk to them, they look away, we think that they're ignoring us. But with actuality, the looking away actually will give them less stimulus, and they can actually process what we're asking them better. And so the thing that we expect from them culturally is the thing that oftentimes makes it more difficult for them to do what we're actually asking them, to do. So going back to your second point, which was on the PowerPoint slides, I did a study with actually a grad student friends a couple of years ago that looked at the role of PowerPoint slides, because the thing, with PowerPoint slides, there's a lot of complaints like, oh, if they have the PowerPoint slides, they're not going to listen to us. They're not going to even come to class, and things of this nature. And so what you were talking about, the relationship between listening in the classroom and then that note-taking process, writing out the notes, not even using a computer. There is a brain connection there, a cognitive connection between that action of writing out and listening, where they actually learn the material better when they do that than when they type up their notes in class, and they start making, there's just something about that reinforcement process that they tend to actually do better in the class. And perform better on assignments, your typical tests and things of that nature. So there's some things cognitively, mentally that are going on that I don't know that we fully understand yet, that are related to listening. I think that we're starting to get into that more and study that more. And again, these are related to technology, how technology is changing learning and the learning process in the classroom. Last point that I'll make, and then I'll, we certainly can move on to something else, which is I was one of the first. I embraced PowerPoint wholeheartedly, both hands, hugged it tightly, and hung on to it for years. I don't use PowerPoint in the classroom at all anymore. And the reason being is because I found that after a while, it constrains that conversational process that we have with students. That it's not that I'm anti-technology, because I'm not, but it is that free-flowing discussion of ideas that happens in the classroom. I think that when we depend too heavily on this particular type of software, it gets in the way of that. And it makes the classroom far too regimented. And this is not to say that I never use PowerPoint in the classroom, but I'm real particular about the way in which I do it. In fact, a lot of times I end up writing stuff on the board, and then I just take a snapshot of it now, and then I upload it for the class so that we have what we talked about in class. So this sort of PowerPoint after the fact, I guess, Anyway, I'll stop now.
That's good. We have actually 9 questions now, so we've got a lot to get through. Juliana, again from Colombia, said, for more than 10 years, I've been researching listening in my country, and I'm currently doing a doctorate in education with this subject. Developing the state of the art, I found the ILA and have read several documents and publications, especially Bodie and Janusik. It strikes me that this field of research is very developed in North America and Europe, but not in Latin America. Why has the ILA not expanded its presence to these countries? Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, I can't necessarily speak to why the ILA hasn't expanded, but my limited experience with, so going over to Finland, for instance, the structure of the universities is different. And even what interpersonal communication means is different. China, for instance, is primarily mass media. So if you say I'm getting a degree in communication, you usually put an S at the end and you're talking about mass communication. Similarly, in Korea, there's very little interpersonal communication influence. So any kind of listening research is going to be audience research, or how people process, mass produced messages. There might be a little bit of persuasion, but only that kind of mass communication, persuasion, not interpersonal influence type of research. I'm not sure it's even all that very well developed in North America. I think a lot of the people on this screen, and Laura has written about this in particular, the notion that, if you look at the volumes of research that have been done on communication and speaking, they trump the, volumes of research that have been done on listening. Even though there's a thread of listening throughout the history of most of our primary organizations, it's very muted at times, and limited by looking at listeners as passive as opposed to active participants in the interaction process. So again, I don't know about the ILA in particular, but I know that in terms of research, I think there are some constraints given the construction or the organization of universities and faculties, that perhaps there's something with the organization of faculties in North America that's made the research a little bit more lively here than it has in other places.
I would also add to this is that really it's a relatively small field, and so what you end up with are a lot of maybe not a lot, but individuals who are working in many cases individually. So for a long time, I was doing listening research essentially on my own. I'm the only person at my university now that does it. At one point, we had a couple of people who were interested in it, but they've retired. I'm it. And so I will say this is one of the beauty parts of technology, is that it makes it much easier to collaborate with Graham or with Marguerite Imhoff in Germany, and other people that I've managed to and had the distinct pleasure of working with. So I think that in some part it's this sort of idea of getting a group of people who are focused on it and jump-starting that type of research. Now, Graham did that to some extent at the previous university he was at, but the question is it going to stay? Is it going to continue without him there, to support it and to push it and to bring more students, into doing that type of research? Or is he going to be now at your new school? Are you going to have the ability to essentially set up that type of listening lab and bring students to, to the field and get them jump-started? Because that's the way you grow a field, is you bring new students in and get their interest and push them forward and send them out in the world to do, more listening research. And I don't necessarily know the answer to that question.
Yeah.
So,
And also, Julianne, I would encourage you to look at these various literatures and not use the word listening in your searches. So there are a plethora of other terms that people use when they're talking about basically the same thing. So, and what we tried to do in the source book is to bring those measures over and give them a listening spin. So Harry Reese does a lot of work on what he calls perceived partner responsiveness. It's basically just perception of the person being a good listener. Segala did a bunch of work in the 80s on interaction involvement. Mm-hmm. It's basically the degree to which the person's being a good listener. Mm-hmm. And conversational sensitivity, the work of John Daly, it's basically the degree to which the person's being a good listener. Yeah. And so you have these terms as well as others like understanding and the whole literature on empathy. And so there are these large chunks of literature that I think if you just kind of took the word that they use and replaced it with listening, it would make the same argument. Mm-hmm. And so because we as scholars don't produce widgets, we produce ideas. We feel like we have to put our own spin on that idea, and so we call it something else. But it's just reinventing the wheel all over again. There used to be a division at ILA that was headed by Andrew Woolman called Not Reinventing the Wheel. And I really like that division because the point was, let's stop doing the same thing over and over again and maybe spend a little bit of time trying to synthesize and aggregate some of this stuff.
Yeah. And the other thing that I can add, Juliana, is it looks like you're reading a lot of the literature, and I know in many journals they have the contact information of the authors. Feel free to reach out to the authors through email, because I think that that's where a lot of the collaborative research comes from too. So I think that probably anybody on this screen would be happy to interact with you and talk with you and potentially even do research with you in the future too, which could be really cool. So now we have 10 new messages, so I better get moving here. Mark Wong says, I think feeling heard is subjective. You can listen the same way and different people will react differently. Even the same speaker can feel differently from day to day. And if a listener repeats the same behavior mechanically, people can spot it. Care first and let that drive your behavior. I'm not sure it's a question, but it could be.
It could be an empirical question. I mean,
it could be.
It's a good idea. I'm not sure it's supported by empirical evidence, but it makes a lot of sense.
Now, Gary Tan says listening behaviors can be different across different cultural contexts too, which I think is something that Graham and Debra were just addressing. So Mark then says, yes, Gary, eye contact, for example, is different across cultures. I think technology feeds on our deep need to be heard, and that's why we share, tweet, text, and such. But I'm not sure it's helped us make others feel heard. Oh, that's a good point. What I'm seeing in the classroom is the increase in multitasking activities so much so that eye contact becomes secondary. That's for sure. Kathy O'Brien says, Debra's point about children, fabulous. This is also very true for introverts. Many say they are distracted by making eye contact and that interrupts their thinking process.
Yeah. I would like to speak to the multitasking point that was just made, because I've actually done some training related to multitasking. And the first thing is, I would say, is multitasking does not exist. It is a misnomer. It doesn't exist. In psychology and the studies that they've done is what it's called is switch tasking, because our brain it literally cannot do multiple things at the same time. There's like 2% estimated of the world's population that can truly multitask, and then there's the rest of us. And so what we're essentially doing is we're working on one thing and then very quickly switching over to the next thing. So if you're typing something and someone comes in the room and asks a question, then what happens is that you switch over to the rules that go with answering a question from this person, and then you mentally switch back to whatever it is that you're working on the screen, okay? So what we do know is that multitasking actually, it's bad on a number of levels, but from an educational standpoint, it really significantly interferes with the learning process, because you don't get something deeply enough into your brain so that it can then transfer to become part of a memory so that you can then recall it at a later time. So people who say that they just can't remember anything anymore, I'm guessing that some of those people could probably go back and look at their personal behaviors and they find that they're multitasking too much. And that's part of what the problem is. And so I work very hard on that in the classroom. They don't want to let go of their phones, and so I make them put them on silent and turn them upside down and put them in the middle of a table, because we work in active learning classrooms and we have tables. And so they can all see them, but they can't go off. It seems to make them feel better when they do that. But the point about multitasking is definitely an excellent one, and especially with regards to what happens in the classroom.
Yeah, and Sheila has added an interesting observation. She says, after several trips to South America, I noticed that there is not the same level of use of cell phones and other devices as there seems to be in the US. Maybe they don't have the same listening problems that we have in the US. Everyone is not walking around looking at their cell phones.
Yeah. So.
Maybe, although I wonder the degree to which our listening problems or barriers have really changed all that much as a function of cell phones. I mean, there's not really any research to tell us one way or the other, so it's really more of just a question or a curiosity. Sheila, you've been training and listening both before and after the advent of smartphones, and so, I mean, you could maybe speak to this anecdotally, or at least within your own realm of experience and teaching to larger groups, right? I would imagine your sample size is a couple of thousand, so would be a good sample to kind of think through. Are you teaching differently, or are you training differently now that there is, cell phones? Is it drastically different, or just slightly different and the examples are different?
Well, first, I'm retired now, so but I just did a program tonight. But
hey, there you go.
It just seems that it's drastically, in the United States, it's drastically different. Wherever you are in the US, everybody has their cell phone out. It's in their hand constantly, whether you're, in the grocery store line, commuting, wherever, everybody has their cell phone out. But in a number of foreign countries, they don't have them out. They're not visible. So I don't know whether they don't have them, but there just seems to be a much better connection between people when they don't have their cell phones out. As Debra mentioned, the cell phone, whether you're using it or not, impacts the conversation that you have, the topic of the conversation, how deeply you get into the topic, and so on. And so it just seems like in the US that we're moving away from listening. It's, we want to control the conversation. We want to control who's talking to us and when they're talking and how much they get to talk to us and so on. And so, we text them when we don't want to have a conversation with them. And we, a variety of ways that we want to control the flow of information, or that somebody's talking to us, where that doesn't seem to be happening as much in a lot of countries. It's just kind of amazing how you just don't see the cell phones, particularly a number of places in South America, but even like Iceland, you don't see cell phones out all the time.
Sheila, Juliana respectfully disagrees with you, and she says it's not true. Progressively, we stop looking into the eyes to be busy with the phones. And I'm interested, Kathy O'Brien, I know that you're over in Singapore. I'm interested in what you see in Singapore and the other countries as well, in terms of cell phone usage in public.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, I was dying to jump in. In many Asian countries, it's even worse than what Sheila was just describing. I can share with you that here in Singapore, for example, when we were already in the habit of using text as the first way of messaging, of talking to someone, when we switched over from audio to text, I got back to the US, and most people I came across in the US hadn't even heard of text yet, didn't really even know what it was. So it became really quite obsessive here and very heavily used. I can remember when my first son was a baby, and that was 15 years ago. Whereas in the US, I know it's people seem to have endless data too, so they're using their phones in many, many, many ways now. But 15 years ago, I didn't see it that way. So it's really mainstream in this culture. I see it in Indonesia and Thailand and most of the Asian countries I work in all the time. The little bit I wanted to add is only anecdotal, but I just thought I'd throw it out there. In my observation, it's the very senior people in organizations, when we work with executives, the very senior people are extremely good at putting it away or not even bringing it with them to begin with, focusing, listening, being in the moment, very demanding of what happens in that moment. You better have whatever you're going to cover with them, you better be totally prepared. But I find with very senior people, listening does seem to still be a part of their repertoire. And the lower down you go, the worse it gets on that scale. Now, I have loads of observations about this. For example, if you train junior people, if we do workshops for, or let's say even mid-level people, I think to some extent they are beholden to others. So their phones, they've got the phone all the time because the boss could be messaging them about something that they're expected to respond to right away, or they've just got so many balls in the air. Whereas when you're very senior, I think you have the privilege more of being able to say, oh, well, someone else is taking care of that. I'm here to listen to you. I also wonder if it could be a generational thing. Most very senior people are older, so they didn't grow up with the phone so much, so maybe it's not so much a part of their habit. Or it could be that one of the ways you rise to the top is by being able to shut things off and focus. I'd just throw those observations into the conversation.
These are great empirical questions. I think that would be awesome research topics. I don't know how you get to many of them, but I think, the idea that as cell phone use and as certain types of cell phone use changes across cultural barriers, that we should see changes in listening behaviors or barriers or preferences or expectations or whatever the case might be. Get a 16 country panel together and map them in terms of cell phone use, and then both individual cell phone use and sort of cultural cell phone use, and then figure out some of the measures. You got to buy the book first, though. You have to get and then figure out what you're going to measure. Or, are you measuring behaviors or perceptions, or this notion of feeling listened to on a regular basis, or responded to on a regular basis, or what's the dependent variable that we're really interested in? Are we suggesting that technology is changing our behaviors, changing our perceptions of behaviors, changes our expectations, changing our perceptions of something other than behaviors, changing our attitudes, or all of the above? I'm not sure we have the theoretical specificity at this point. We just have a tendency to say everything's going to hell, when it may not necessarily be that way. I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe it is. I don't know.
So I'll just make a personal observation, is that I'm very strategic in when and how I use my phone. So, for example, one of the things that I will do is I try to remember before anyone, if someone walks into my office, I try to remember, and I mute my office phone, and I will try to mute my mobile phone as well, my personal phone as well. Sometimes I don't remember to do that. And if the phone, invariably, it seems like it'll go off, if it dings at me and it's a text, I just ignore it. But if it's somebody's calling me on it, I will purposely swipe it, turn it off, and I will turn the phone upside down. And it always, particularly the students, it always seems to surprise them when I do that, because they're so used to whenever and wherever they are, when the phone goes off, unless it's perhaps in the middle of a class, they're going to answer it. And for me, that one of the reasons I strategically do that is because for whoever walks into my office at that moment in time, then to me it's showing them very much a sign of respect, that they are more important in that moment than whatever's going on with that that piece of technology. The same thing happens with other types of technological use as well. Is one of the strange things that we have in our school is we're wired for cable, digital TV, whatever you want to call it. And so I actually have a television in my office, and a lot of times I run it with CNN and other types of news programs that are on. And when somebody walks in the office, I turn the TV off, whatever's on, because again, it's the idea that it's a sign of respect for for whoever comes in. And I tell them up front, it's sort of like, this is noise. I can't really listen to you when this noise is on. And so I think it comes back to us in the way in which we choose to use technology. And I would hope that the idea of, as we train people, hopefully to be better listeners and things like that, if they take those lessons to heart, they become strategic users of technology. There's nothing wrong with technology. It's just how we use it to either help or hinder the communication that we have with others that's important.
Yeah. And actually, Gary Tan said in Singapore and in China, I know of some people who use 2 cell phones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, that's true.
And Kathy O'Brien is saying, yes, that happens. That happens a lot. I see there are some people here that we haven't gotten questions from, and I want to make sure that we've covered your questions and concerns. So, Catherine Thompson, I see you and your cute little puppy, I have to say. Are there any questions that you would like to ask Graham and Debra? No? We've got Laura S.'s iPad, and let me see if there's anyone else there that we may have missed. No, I think that would be all. Terry Varner, any questions? Any more questions?
Yeah, I had actually in the chat earlier had asked both either Graham or Debra if you could talk a little bit more about how the listening research of the listening scholarship isn't taken seriously, and why you think that is, and what recommendations you could make in terms of a professor who's teaching undergraduate students who are hoping to get their research published.
Mm-hmm.
How do I say this gently? I think the good listening research is taken seriously. I think the bad listening research, just like bad other research, is not taken seriously. Mm-hmm. And so I think the best way to be taken seriously is to do good research, to use, to develop scales and other measures that stand up to strong tests of validity, to ground the research in theory, whether that's existing theory or theory that you have to make up because there isn't theory to cover what you're interested in. But I have found that people very much respect the work that several people in the ILA do. And so I think it is taken seriously.
And I think it's taking the idea of listening and then applying it to areas where it's important but perhaps has traditionally been ignored. So I remember a couple of years ago, we sent out an article that actually addressed mobile phone use and talked about listening and the impact that it had on privacy, its relationship to privacy management, and a couple of other I think conversational sensitivity was a part of the study. And I remember the editor coming back and saying, wow, we've never really thought about this before. And it's like, from our perspective, it's like, how could you not think about this? Because it's, the technology is changing the way, at least it seems to us, that we communicate with one another. But the question is, how is that? And how is that change being evidenced? And is it a perceptual change? And it really isn't, the whole 9 yards. And so, but I agree with Graham. If we're going, publishing is never easy, but if you do good research, it's easier. And if you do really good research, then people start looking for that work. So, that's one of the reasons that we did the source book, is because we want to raise the profile, if you will, of listening and listening research, and encouraging others and helping others to do good research is one of the ways in which we we'll be able to grow the field. And as we continue to work on projects together and other book projects together, that's ultimately the goal that we have, is to raise the profile of the field, but also to help others think about those important questions while they're, developing those research projects. So.
And this is my second time. I just had a great question and it went away. This aging thing is not treating me nicely. What can I say there? Mark Wong says, I think instruments and measurements are very important. On the other hand, most people know if their spouse or boss listen, even if they know very little about the subject. And actually, Mark, thank you for writing that, because now I remember what I was going to ask. I know that Terry is very much a qualitative researcher, and in talking with Graham and Debra, you had indicated that there are some qualitative instruments or measures in the source book. What kinds of things would qualitative people be interested in looking at in the book?
We've got a chapter up front that primarily focuses on ethnography, ethnographic methods for ways of studying listening from that perspective. The one kind of method, one clear method that's more on the narrative side is Jan Bavelis's work on micro analysis of face-to-face dialogue. Exploring interactions and she uses a very inductive approach to look at the existence of certain types of behavior and patterns of behavior in interaction. And she very rarely puts numbers on her findings. She does use some statistical analyses, but she primarily uses some grounded analyses. There's a measure in there called the I went blank. It's Don Rubin's measure. Listenability style guide. So this is the degree to which messages are listenable. The corollary is readability. So you've got these readability indices that are highly quantitative. They've got a metric, 8th grade level, 6th grade level. He argues against that approach pretty strongly to suggest kind of like what Sheila was talking about earlier in terms of, it's not, behaviors don't necessarily add, but there's just like this gestalt kind of, at some point it's listenable, and you don't have to have 5 of the 8 components. You can actually have only one of the components and it still be a listenable message. So it's in the context in which it's situated. So his measure, he argues that his measure is more on that narrative or qualitative, so-called qualitative side, as opposed to the more numerical or so-called quantitative side. So those are some examples.
Yeah, and those are great examples. And when you were talking about listenable, I was automatically thinking about healthcare and how I think a lot of patients have difficulty listening to the messages from their physicians or their healthcare provider, because oftentimes emotions are added into that. So do any of those instruments that you identify have an emotional component that factors in as well?
I'm thinking. I mean, that's one of the issues, is that when you have 65 measures and you're trying to remember what the different ones.
I mean, the PONS. You profiled this, Laura.
I did.
The PONS deals with the degree to which people pick up on certain emotions and messages. I mean, there's a measure of empathy called the interpersonal reactivity index. There's a measure of mindfulness that's in there that clearly deals with your ability to listen to your own emotions and be non-judgmental about your own level of awareness.
Mm-hmm. I think rhetorical sensitivity, if I remember, has an element of that as well. The idea of being able to recognize the underlying emotion. So conversational sensitivity includes something, being able to read other people, understanding, the underlying emotion that, can color a message. That's included in that as well.
Yeah, and with 65 measures in there, which is absolutely amazing to me. I cannot wait to get my hands on this book. But I know that it went to print a number of months ago too. So to ask you to remember all 65 is certainly unfair. But it's fun to watch you think. So do you have any other great stories about putting this book together, like the hardest instrument that you had to find, or the best find that you had?
It was hold on a second, I was thinking about this earlier.
Listening practices feedback report.
Thank you. That we became detectives for that one, because this is one that was mentioned in the research. It was in a couple of articles early on. And then, we did a basic Google search and found where a couple of people had used it in their research and had gotten permission. But of course, nobody really completely described the scale, and we needed permission to be able to present it in the book. So when we went looking for the authors of it, it was a consulting team. The husband had passed away. One of the other co-authors that used it in the article, let us know that he originally had copyrighted it. That means we had to find, the wife. And she originally lived in Virginia. She had moved. I mean, it probably took us, I'm going to guess, at least 2 months to track her down.
6-8 weeks.
Yeah.
And Sheila, you may remember Jan Brandt and Phil Emmerich and those folks.
Yeah. Been a while. So, but we eventually located her, managed to get, the permission slip, if you will, to her, and she signed off on everything and sent it back. And we are eternally grateful that she did that, because there's we see these mentions in some of these older articles for these particular measurements, and we can't find copies of them anymore. And who's to say they may be a great instrument, but we need to be able to test it more with using the technology we have today, and the statistical prowess we have with the software and things that just weren't available at the time that many of them were generated. So it's one of those things that if you know of a good one that's out there, we're thinking that there will be, Sourcebook of Listening 2 at some point in the future, and we're already gathering, measures to include in it in the, in the future. But it's just a terrible thing to sort of see this historical record lost.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the reasons that measure is included in the book.
That's terrific. We actually only have 10 minutes left, and we do have 2 more questions that came in. The first from Catherine Thompson. I think my question centers on the brain's functions and how the limbic system, parentheses, anxiety, depression, stress, end parentheses, impacts listening, especially for patients interacting with healthcare providers. For example, how listening is impacted by antecedents, prior trauma, etc. Are there measures that take into account these antecedent emotional states?
Mm-hmm.
That's a complex question, Catherine.
I think the first thing, and then I'll pass it on to Graham, is as he mentioned earlier, not everything that is profiled in the measurement section is like a scale or a questionnaire or something like that. And so one of the things that we do profile in there is fMRI, and how it's being used and can be used as a way for us to better understand what's going on in the mind, and how people respond in, listening situations and things like that. Because to get at that question, I think that might be the most interesting and perhaps the best way to ultimately answer it at some point in the future. So.
Yeah, I mean, the question is interesting because the extent to which listening scholars have looked at antecedent states, it's typically been individual differences like personality. There's a scale that we profile called the highly sensitive person scale. These kind of, these person level differences, and not necessarily like your example, prior trauma. There's not a lot of, work looking at the degree to which that influences listening per se, even though there is a ton of research, brain research on how trauma influences the way the brain is wired and lights up during certain stimulus tasks. So I think that's where the fMRI profile would probably be the closest to getting at some of the issues that that you're after.
Mm-hmm.
And Mark Wong wants to know what each of you learned from writing this book.
Oh, wow. I learned that Graham is a fabulous person to collaborate with. I mean, I knew that from working on articles, but when you do something that takes essentially a year or a year and a half of your life, and you're still friends by the time you finish it, I think that's really, really important. But to speak more specifically to the research, I think that it helped us to, at least it helped me to identify a lot of different types of areas, a lot of different specific measures that I keep looking at them, and I'm like, I could use this in the future. And to do, I used this phrase earlier, a deep dive, into an area that in a way that I'd never done it, before. So I think that is absolutely going to inform my own scholarship, and I hope that it makes it better for me and makes me a better scholar as I, start working on projects in the spring.
Terrific.
Yeah, I'll second the working well together. It was a very pleasant process, actually, to work with Debra on this, because she at the beginning of this, she said she realized that she's really good at some stuff that I hate to do, and that's absolutely right. That she's really good at a lot of the stuff that I'm so glad I did not have to deal with in the process. I learned a lot. I think one of the main things that I learned, I got to learn a lot of new methods that I kind of had only heard in passing or read in passing. I got to really dive deep into some things that I'd been wanting to read about. So it gave me an excuse to kind of read deeply about different methods. My students at LSU, this book was finished, while I was still there. And so we've actually designed a study that came directly from working on this source book, that's looking at the degree to which I think we have like 15 or 20 scales that in various ways kind of measure the same thing. And so we've launched what we're kind of calling 6 studies that are going to be packaged together to look at the degree to which some of these scales may actually be able to be aggregated or combined or thrown away. We may not need all of these scales. So, so it's taught me that there is, heuristic value in writing something like this that can spawn new research ideas and new research projects.
Terrific. And Sheila actually has one last question for us, I think. Sheila, if you want to unmute and go ahead and ask it yourself.
Well, I'm fascinated. I can't wait to see all of the scales that you have looked at, because it seems like, in having been in ILA for over 30 years, I'm just not sure that we have really identified all the things that we need to measure that are a part of listening. So let me just give you a little experience that I had. Tell me how you would, what kind of scale you would put this on. 2 years ago, when we were in Tucson at the convention, Jenny Grau and Anita Dorchik did and one other person, I can't remember, did a program for attorneys. And I was in the program for a while, and they did a role play, and they put Kent Zimmerman and myself with this young woman who was an attorney, and she was blind. And so, we're doing this role play, and it's kind of mediation. And so she's listening. We are supposed to be a married couple, only they complicated it more. I was supposed to be the husband and Kent was supposed to be the wife. So anyway, lots of role playing. But so she listened to us, and I cannot tell you what she did, but it was the best listening I have ever experienced in my life. So she obviously was not making eye contact. She would look, put her face in our direction and, rapt attention. But it was really a life-changing experience, because I thought, oh my gosh, I think that's the first time that I felt like I was truly, truly, truly listened to, and I don't even know what she did. So, is there a different set of behaviors that you use if the person is not sighted or isn't in the room with you, or what other senses play a role in it? But it's kind of the gestalt that you were talking about. I couldn't put a finger on what she did, but I knew I had been listened to.
Yeah, I will speak from personal experience, because I have a friend who is blind, and one of the things that she did, is going back to what you're talking about with the attorney, is she had to train herself on how to properly. She gives the impression of eye contact, even though she can't, obviously can't see. But one of the things that she once told me is that for someone who's sighted, if you think about it, there are a lot of visual distractions. If the person walking across the room and, in the back of the coffee shop when you're having coffee with someone, for someone else, it may be the television, in the room and things like that. So actually reducing the distractions that were available to her through this particular sense makes it easier for her to focus, because there's less competition, if you will. So from a research perspective, I think that, it would be a question of measuring or trying to figure out a way in which to assess cognitive load. At what point does a cognitive load become such that it does begin to, interfere? Now, cognitive load is a very broad term, and it includes internal as well as external, processes. But I would argue that, those visual, perceptions that we have certainly add to our cognitive load and can affect ultimately how we listen as a result. And I'm sure Graham's got something to add to this as well.
I think it goes back. I think it was Mark that mentioned this, right? Like, there's measures of, or maybe just an item, like, did you feel listened to? And that's we may never know in any given moment why we felt that way, and frankly, it doesn't matter, right?
Well, if you want to replicate it.
It might matter if you want to go train someone. It might matter if you're interested in the mechanisms that allow listening to be possible in that, way. But for our everyday lives, I think one of Mark's points earlier was scales and measurements, and they're good for certain purposes, but it doesn't matter in our everyday life. It doesn't matter, right? So there's one thing to be, said about feeling listened to, and there's another thing to be said about how am I supposed to act in this situation. And there's a whole nother set of variables about, antecedents and consequences of that feeling listened to. So that's really the crux of the book, is what are you trying to do? What's your research purpose? What's your question that you're trying to answer, and then stake out a definition that allows you to answer that question and find a measurement or create a measure of some sort that allows you to measure what it is that you want to measure. Not what's easy to measure, not what's convenient to measure, not what's cheap to measure, but what you need to measure to answer the question that you're trying to ask. And I think if you get the book, which you should buy the book. If you get anything out of the book, that's really the lesson out of the book is, don't pick measures because they happen to be profiled. Pick measures because they happen to serve the purpose that you want to serve for that research project.
Yeah, and that is really good. Kathy O'Brien, you had said that perhaps you had a last closing comment for us.
I would just like to say to both Debra and Graham that I encourage you to make sure that the newly revamped CLP process includes your book. I wish I had your book when I was doing the CLP.
Yeah, and for those of you who are unaware, CLP stands for Certified Listening Professional, and that is a designation from the International Listening Association. And by the way, we're holding our next convention in Dublin in June, and that's going to be absolutely incredible. So if you get the chance, definitely come out to Dublin to see us. Juliana has a closing thought. She says, thank you for this conference. It has been very helpful for my research. I hope to be an active member of the ILA very soon. I would like to keep in connection with you, which is terrific. That would be great. Graham, Debra, I love how I look at you on the screen as if you can tell that I am, but that's exactly where you show up on my screen. Graham and Debra, thank you so much. You were wonderful guests on this. Your book is extremely important. I'm going to be sharing my screen in a second, so everybody will have what the book looks like, the title, and the 20% off code if you order by March. So that's going to be important. And as usual, Phil Turpak, our technical director, did a fabulous job. Thank you very much. And we will see you in about 3 months when Kathy O'Brien actually is going to be our next guest. Take care and good night.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Thank you.